Character creation can be one of the most exciting and yet one of the most daunting parts of tabletop gaming. Sometimes you're brimming with character ideas and great backstories. Other times a character dies unexpectedly and you're suddenly scrambling to make a new character. Everyone has their own process for a new character. Today I want to talk about my process from having the perspective of both Dungeon Master and player. I'm going to talk about questions I ask my players as well as myself in order to draw out more of the character. Once again, when I talk about the mechanics, I'm referring to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but the general aspects apply to every tabletop gaming, obviously, and even LARP if you're into that kind of stuff. The number one tip I have is to rationalize as much as you can. It will naturally lead you down a rabbit hole that will give you more of the character than you might initially realize. I hope this becomes more clear as I go on. Where should you start? Race? Class? Personality? Fighting style? My advice is to never take anyone's opinion of a starting point as absolute. There's no clear defined way to start a character. It's going to have to come organically. In my head, I usually get multiple things at the same time. For example, one time I got Wizard and the personality first at the exact same time. Another time I had Monk first. I've had Elf first. My head goes in 1,000 directions at all times. So there have been many characters in my campaign that everything came at the same time. You need to let it happen the way it happens naturally in your head. There's one character I want to talk about and keep referencing a lot. His name is Akashi, and my first thought when creating him was, I want to make an evil character. Second was that I wanted him to be an assassin archetype of rogue. Then I felt that I wanted him to be very cold, heartless, and very, very ruthless. At the same time, I made him lawful evil for the purpose of keeping him contained as a playable character. I'll explain that a bit later. I decided on human because I'm boring, and also because of story reasons that I'll explain later as well. So, you've picked your race, class, and general personality. Now we need to start adding some details, mechanically and personally. You need to pick proficiencies, equipment, background, fighting style, etc. As I created Akashi through D&D Beyond, I began filling in things that made sense. But just before, I created the backstory framework. Just to summarize, Akashi came from a poor village that was autonomous to a degree. They were basically in the middle of nowhere, and so they ended up self-governing. He had an older brother, Albine, who was the prized person of the village. He went off to fight in a conflict as a hired hand in exchange for money and supplies in the village. But his brother died in that conflict. Akashi's parents were already harsh and cold towards him, and Almine's death drove their relationship even further apart. There was one other hated person in the village, and it was a tiefling woman. She was hated because of her devilish heritage. They met and eventually fell in love. But one day she was found in her home, hanged. This was halfway through her pregnancy with their child. He wasn't sure if the village hanged her or if she hung herself, but in his eyes, they were responsible regardless. So he snapped and murdered everybody in his entire village, and burned it all to the ground. He started with his parents. This is where he found that killing brought him absolute joy, and torturing even better. Shortly after, he spent a week of mourning his losses in a cave, with no food and just a little water. He hallucinated for much of it, seeing his wife and brother. By the end of the week, his tears had dried up, and the only thing left was the cold-hearted killer. So then, we get to the details of the character mechanically. First up on D&D Beyond after race and class is the proficiencies. Rogues get 4, so I chose Perception, Stealth, Investigation, and Acrobatics. At this point, I rationalized everything and how it ties into the character. For Perception, I decided that during his time in the cave, he realized he had excellent hearing and trained his senses very specifically afterwards. For Stealth, he was not very good fighting in a one-on-one duel like his brother, so he decided to work on getting the drop on his enemies. He had a little practice when he took his village down. For Investigation, it basically came down to 2 things. I tied it into his tool proficiency, which will come later, and I also decided that Akashi was going to be very pragmatic. Even the choice of Stealth was a pragmatic decision. Acrobatics was something he trained in conjunction with Stealth. In order to make the best use of his less than straightforward fighting style, he wanted to make sure he could escape a situation, or be able to parkour essentially, as it would be very useful to assassinations. For expertise, I chose Stealth and Perception. To him, those were his 2 best traits, and he wanted to make the very best of them. For background, I chose Criminal for obvious reasons. gave him deception as an auto proficiency. I decided that his personality becoming so muted and cold, it became harder for others to tell when he was lying, because everything he says has the same tone to it. Since his moral compass shrunk a bit, the truth and lies are two means to an end for him. He could care less which he has to use to get what he wants. For the other proficiency, I chose survival. His village was mostly farmland, so he learned a lot about signs of civilization, food, etc. Also, he had to survive on his own after he burned his village, so he became good at that. The Thieves' Cant ability that comes with Rogue I was able to rationalize by saying that he picked this trait up during his time doing mercenary work. He noticed it happening among the more shifty mercenaries and learned it himself. Then we have a gaming set and a tool proficiency. For gaming set, I chose Dragon Chess, and for tools, I chose Carpenter. What made sense for a small village that was self-sustaining to a degree? You would definitely need a carpenter. I also decided that Akashi formally met his wife, Nicked, when he built a wooden table for her. Carpenters need to have a good eye and be good with their hands, so it made perfect sense for him as a rogue with Dex as the highest stat, and with Perception as a proficiency. Investigation ties in as well, because you need to be able to sift through wood, search for imperfections, and also diagnose problems if he was on the job to fix something rather than build. This also plays into his deductive reasoning and pragmatism becoming amplified once he becomes evil. Now, with Dragon Chess, I had that be him and Nick's favorite pastime. They played chess all the time. Nick would always insist on playing black. This is important because in the current time, he carries a black queen piece with him at all times. Before a big mission, he takes the piece out and looks at it for a few moments. To him, if he dies, he can be with his wife again. If he lives, he can continue his pursuit of killing. The equipment choice was standard, and I didn't do too much rationalizing here, but his main weapon I did. I chose a rapier, but I reskinned it essentially as a straight guardless katana. It was his brother's, and he gave it to Akashi just before leaving. This and the black chest piece are representative of the two ties to his humanity. Should he ever throw these to the wayside, he would become completely unhinged. But he's not completely unhinged, and that's important. A character like that won't exist for very long in a campaign. When I was creating him, I made sure there were safeguards built into his character. He's pragmatic, cold, and muted, which allows him to keep his impulses in check. He understands that if he goes off and kills every human he sees, he won't be able to continue killing. Eventually, he'll be caught and probably put away. Jail would be the worst case scenario for him if he couldn't find a way to kill someone or himself. That kind of scenario actually terrifies him. It's the only thing that does. So, he decided to kill within the law. He'll especially take the job if the target is human. Likewise, he won't turn on the party because it's not smart to do so. A party makes him more likely to keep killing. A party keeps him safe. But make no mistake, this is not a neutral character. His intent is evil. If it became legal to kill humans, he would instantly go out on the hunt to kill every single one, with himself being the final kill. A neutral character would do so for the right price. Akashi would go out of his way to do it. If it's a dead or alive contract, regardless of the race, he would automatically go for dead, even if alive is a greater price. He will go out of his way to be as cruel as possible to get what he wants. A neutral character would use cruelty as a necessity. Akashi would do so even if it's not needed, so long as he can get away with it. When making an evil character, I feel it's necessary to have safeguards like this. In general, if a character trait is inherently going to derail or slow a campaign to a crawl, it might not be the best idea. If you're always going to give your party problems, what are you even doing? Don't get me wrong, inter-party conflict can be great for the plot, but if your entire character just becomes a foil to everything around you, I guess there's a place for it, but just be careful and talk to your DM and fellow players. Be transparent about what you want. Just remember, your character is going to exist in the context of an adventure with other players and other player characters. Be mindful of what character traits you decide on when thinking about this context. Now, lastly, stats can and often should be incorporated into how your character is. What does a low intelligence character look like for you? How about low charisma? High charisma? It's up to you to interpret how your stats coincide with your other stats and backstory. With Akashi, Dex is his highest stat, which I already talked about. I rolled pretty well, so I ended up with 4 other scores above 10. Wisdom is the next highest stat, followed by Constitution, and then Strength and Intelligence equal. Charisma is his lowest stat at a negative modifier. I don't know if you know any carpenters, but they're pretty hardy in general. You gotta be pretty strong and durable, hence having good strength and constitution. I already talked about his awareness and senses being pretty good and how pragmatic he tends to be. So it makes sense for him to be pretty good in those 5 areas. So I decided that charisma should be the low score. That translates to his general demeanor. He's not very good at talking, as he didn't get an illustrious education. He knows worldly things, hence having a good intelligence score, but he's not very knowledgeable of the finer things in life, and just doesn't know how to talk to people very well. The one thing he can do is lie for reasons I explained, but persuasion is really not his thing. So hopefully you can understand that once you start to rationalize everything, you can create more of an ironclad, more interesting character. Just about everything weaves together to create this singularity known as Akashi Hiko. Now, as a DM, I usually ask a few pointed questions to my players to help draw them out a bit more. The first thing I ask is who their parents are. Sometimes I don't have to though, because it's already in their backstory. If it's not included, I'll ask very specific questions about the parents. What were they like? How did they treat you? How did you treat them? This has such an influence on a character as they exist today. The next thing is, how did they come to find this class? Why did the person decide to become a cleric to a death god? For Akashi, I explained that rogue and assassin seemed to fit best in his mind for his own skill set. Next, what are they doing here in insert where the character is starting? What is the character trying to accomplish right now? It helps to establish that so that the character isn't just wandering around aimlessly. What does your character want short-term and long-term? What are their goals? It can be simple or complex. Akashi's goals are fairly simple. He wants to continue killing and bring suffering to as many humans as he can get away with. But as I mentioned previously, when I say get away with it, it usually means within the confines of the law. A lot of times I like to do a Session 0 one-shot to RP the character to the start of their adventure with the party. That does 3 things that I really like. 1, it gives the player a little bit of time to get comfortable with playing the character. 2, it helps frame the player's mindset on the character's current and long-standing goals. 3, it gives me as the DM a little insight about how this character is going to be before it's introduced in-game. What I'm going to do more often is go through the proficiencies and ask about them in more detail like I do for myself. I think it's really important for the DM and player to spend a good amount of time discussing the character so that they're on a similar page. Some of the personality can come out in-game, and that's fine. There should be wiggle room there. But my philosophy is to fill in what you can when you can, and let the rest come out organically. I'll usually ask as well about the ideals, flaws, and bonds part of the character sheet. If something is filled out, I'll extrapolate. If not, I'll get something on paper so that they have something to work with in-game. For example, a player of mine chose a character that seeks knowledge, so I asked him a series of questions pertaining to his ideals of knowledge overall. I asked him something to the effect of, if you had to save a burning library with nobody in it, or a burning inn full of people, which would you save? And various questions like that to gauge just how strongly he valued knowledge over other things. In other words, what are the limitations of your ideals, bonds, and flaws? How far are you willing to go with that trait? It can be important to understand how intense or laid back the character is overall. Then, as a DM, I go through and find some areas of the backstory that may be unintentionally or intentionally vague. I try to do something that will surprise the player by filling in details that I won't tell the player about. With Akashi, I left what happened to his wife vague. I left the reasons why she never left the village vague, and why she was hanged ultimately, whether she did it herself, or if the villagers lynched her, or somebody else. Me personally, I don't know that answer. I did that intentionally so that there is some mystery there. For one of my players, his character was banished from his land, but the answer as to why he was banished was kind of vague. So I took that and pulled a bit of a reversal on him. Turns out he wasn't banished for negative reasons. They actually wanted him to get away from his home so that his mother couldn't find him. Turns out she needed to consume his soul for something I'm not going to get into. But here he thought his mother was the good one and his father the bad one. But this whole point has become very central to the plot of the campaign. Another player had him not know who the one who killed his mentor was, and left it up to me. For a long time he had been searching for his mentor's personal blade, assuming that the person who had it was the culprit. He found and retrieved the blade eventually, but but found out that the person who was currently wielding it was not the one who murdered his mentor. The player only recently found out who the culprit is. This is all great stuff that you can play around with as a DM. Give your players some surprises about their own story. And players, although you should be thorough filling in the backstory, don't be afraid to leave a few details up to the DM's interpretation. One thing I want to address before I wrap up is the idea of characters having traits of yourself in real life. Some people want to make characters exactly like themselves, and that's fine. Others want the opposite, and that's also fine. I think subconsciously we all will insert a trait that is like us. I've talked about N before on my Paladin video. He and Akashi have two sides of myself, but exaggerated in a way where if one side didn't exist, how this would go. Like Akashi, I tend to be pretty stoic about everything. Most people who know me understand that a big reaction out of me is usually unlikely. I don't get too excited, but not too angry either. It's extremely rare to see me flip out. But like N, I'm also pretty laid back and nice to just about everyone. So if you're struggling to figure out a personality, maybe do something like that. Choose a trait of yours and make it more uninhibited by any contrasting traits you might have. To wrap this up, I want to give some practical advice. Not for your characters, but for you the person. I'm not a psychologist, but I want to say this because in some way this helped me out. Some of you might be going through some difficult times dealing with who you are as a person. Identity crises aren't uncommon. I know I've had my fair share of them. But I want to encourage you to try this method of breaking down a character on yourself. If you can do this for a fictional character, it exists within you to understand who you are inside. What are your proficiencies? Even if they're not practical, list them. One of my problems was that I found that all my best skills weren't useful in making money. I know a lot of you out there are feeling like that. But the more you understand what you're good at and what you like, the better you can start branching. Are you good at video games? What kinds? Where does that skill come from? I'm good at swing away golf. It's not good at making any money, but what does that entail? Well, it takes a certain amount of diligence to learn the mechanics. It takes an adaptive personality to react and adapt to every variable the game throws at you. It takes a level of timing and patience. There's some calculation involved. There's a lot those traits can be used for. You just might not realize it till you refocus those skills elsewhere. Maybe you feel like you aren't good at anything. But, like I rationalized with Akashi, most skills are learned and trained over time. I think if he had chosen a more artisan profession, he probably wouldn't have been strong or hardy. The point is that there's always time to learn and grow your abilities. Oh god, I bet people are expecting, that's why this video sponsor is Skillshare. Nope, not this channel. Not popular enough, I'm afraid. I do like Skillshare, though. Anyway, back to the seriousness. In some of my darkest moments trying to figure out who I was in life, I subconsciously did some of this psychoanalysis, because I'm a very introspective person. And then after everything, kind of hit me like a huge epiphany what I want to do with my life. And more recently, I made some important changes in my life, and symbolically, I changed my text notification to
Anything can change!
And my belief is that if you truly believe in those words, you can make it happen. Thanks for watching.